Okay. There it goes. There we have it. Okay. There we go. I'm going to talk to you today about the evolution of slavery in the English colonies. Uh, I will do that via the lecture that I have prepared on the transatlantic slave trade and the contours of that. Uh, we'll talk about who was buying slaves and where they were going. We'll talk about the three stages of African American slavery, and we'll talk a little bit about racism and slavery and which came first, the chicken or the egg in American history. So, starting with this graphic that shows a tight back slave ship cross section in the Liverpool Maritime Museum, I'll go from there. So, most slaves that were brought to the New World were brought to the profitable sugar islands and coffee plantations of South America and the West Indies. They were needed for their labor, so most of the profits were in these large scale agricultural interests that were called plantations. Most slaves came from West Africa, as you can see by this map. Most came from the Slave Coast, the Gold Coast, the area around West Africa, and most of them went to the West Indies and Brazil. That made up a huge percentage of the slaves. Only about 4% of all the Africans were brought to British North America, and only a small percentage of the slaves came from East Africa. The Portuguese dominated the slave trade first in the 15th and 16th century. The Dutch dominated the slave trade in the 17th century. And when half of all the slaves were exported during the 18th century, the British dominated the slave trade. And so most of the profits went to the British. The Europeans always controlled the transatlantic slave trade in the sense that they always provided the cash and the purchasing power that drove the slave trade. Now, Africans enslaved other Africans, and there was a trans-Saharan trade network that had been going on for 700 years before the Europeans got involved in it. So Africans were quite used to enslaving each other. They were considered captives of war, and they were brought to be the people who worked in the governments and as domestic servants in the trans-African slave trade of the pre-European era. African slavery was rarely permanent. It was always contingent upon a set labor term, and there was freedom usually offered to the slave after a time period, say 20 years or so. So that was the nature of the slavery as Africans understood it. But the Europeans changed that to a permanent inheritable status that led to lifelong slavery and slavery going forward for as long as you produce children, they would be slaves. Why the turn to African laborers? Well, ethnocentrism had something to do with it. The desire for something better for your own nationality. But there was a labor need that the Indians were not meeting. The Indians tended to die when they were exposed to European microbes. So they were not good as agricultural workers. The labor need continued to motivate the settlers in the New World, and Africans emerged as being ideal as identifiable slaves that were able to be controlled a little more easily than the transatlantic trade. Okay, so that describes the Middle Passage pretty well. During the period of the colonial development, there was a turn for these slaves from African, from some sense of stability in their life, to African American. This started with a 50-year period from 1640 to 1690 of small scale enslavement, mostly in the Chesapeake and Virginia and Maryland. And this involved small numbers of slaves who had close contact with their white overseer at the time. So it was kind of a small scale, not that it was neighborly, but it was less controlled than it will become from 1690 to 1740. The next 50 years showed the large-scale growth of transatlantic slavery. The plantation system is established in the southern colonies with direct importation of workers from Africa who were mostly male, who spoke many languages, Gullah being the most famous of these pidgin languages. That was a language that was spoken on the Sea Islands of South Carolina, but there were many different pidgin languages which combined African and English and Indian languages so that the slaves could communicate with each other. This 50-year period showed worsening conditions as the slave codes became more and more explicit about behaviors that they were controlling. But it's enough to say that the Stoner Rebellion in 1739 near Charleston, South Carolina, involved first-generation Africans looking for their freedom and coming together to kill their masters and rebel against their masters. Well, it was put down by the whites, as you can imagine, and the Stoner Rebellion taught slave owners that it was their newness, their fact that they were first generation Africans, and in the future it would be better to have seasoned slaves, slaves that had spent some time in America and were used to being slaves. So the third period of colonial enslavement from 1740 to 75 saw the growth of the slave population tripling in these years. But it was all by natural increase. There was less importation of slaves from Africa, so that the growing of family and kinship ties became more important. Rural community identity begins to emerge, especially in the task labor areas around Charleston, South Carolina. Labor that was gave the worker a certain amount of freedom to accomplish a task, and then you working hard to accomplish that task, but then having the extra time to do their own thing, to raise vegetables or play music or whatever have you. And so you see the development of a slave community in the rural parts of South Carolina during this period and the beginning of a real African American identity. So that has been the content of what Barbara Jean Fields wrote about in her article that some of you read. And what she more or less starts to argue is that the turn to African labor was not based on racism as we understand the term. Africans were laborers who were more easily identified and controlled, and that eventually adds up to an ideology of inferiority over time, that the association with slavery was the key to racism emerging in American ideology. So she says that from 1676 till 1776, it just emerged a scientific basis of racism, but that only when the American Republic proclaimed that all men were created equal did it mean that they had to explain how they could have this institution of slavery at a time that they're proclaiming human equality. But this allowed them to define Africans as the other, as someone set apart, as someone not included in the social contract. And so a scientific, and I put quotes around the word scientific, begins to emerge in the United States, not until really the 1840s or 1850s do you start to see an ideology that's based in scientific proof. Well, these proofs went on throughout the 19th century and continued into the 20th century, into the theories of Hitler and the Nazis, that there was a master race. And so I would put racism as peaking in American history in the 20th century, at the time that there was mass lynchings going on throughout the South. Did white people feel that there was something to defend, something they were fighting for? And that thing they were fighting for was a society that allowed Blacks to be in society, but understood to be inferior to white people. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you, is what we call racism. And it's a scourge in the American history of the 20th and 21st century, but is just now being challenged fully and on a frontal basis by young people who are out in the streets marching. So I don't know what the future of racism is in the United States. I know that our past involved white people and Black people. Two races were counted in the census of the early 19th century, and everyone fit into one of those races. And today we use the term race to refer to lots of people, but I don't know whether that will continue into the future or whether we will drop the concept of racism and speak more broadly about the human race as the condition of all of us. Okay, That's the lecture. I hope you enjoyed it.